Good afternoon. I'm Alicia B. Hill, the Associate Manager of Marketing and Communications at Groundswell. I'm energized to welcome you to the first webinar in Groundswell's Energy Futures 2024 series. Today, we have a fantastic panel of speakers who will discuss how energy finance is changing. They will share their expertise on what organizations need to know about financing clean energy and climate solutions in the wake of the groundbreaking Inflation Reduction Act. I'd also like to welcome everyone joining us in the audience today. This webinar is a chance for you to ask questions with our panel of experts. So if you have any questions or comments at any time, please share them in the chat. We will answer as many questions as possible during today's session. It's my pleasure to welcome our panel for today's webinar. First, we have Autumn Long, who serves as the director of the Appalachian Solar Finance Fund. The Appalachian Solar Finance Fund is a regional financial and technical assistance program designed to catalyze solar development in coal-impacted Central Appalachian communities. Welcome, Autumn. And we're also joined today by Groundswell's Vice President of Labs and Data Science, Dr. Elvis Moleka. Elvis spearheaded the development of the Lift Solar Toolkit, which provides resources for planning solar developments that serve low and moderate income communities. And we look forward to hearing from a little bit about that and some other insight from you today, Elvis. And finally, we are honored to hear from Hana Vizcarra, the Senior Attorney for National Climate at Earthjustice. Hana advocates for and defends strong federal climate action in her role at Earthjustice, and we're really excited to hear a little bit of her insight on how these new changes can be applied. So with that, I would like to pass the mic over to Autumn.
Hello, is everyone able to hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me today. As Alicia mentioned, I'm Autumn Long. I direct the Appalachian Solar Finance Fund. We are a regional initiative designed to spur solar development in coal-impacted communities in 6 Central Appalachian states. We work in 147 counties in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Tennessee. You can check out our website, solarfinancefund.org, to see a full list of our eligibility area. And that eligibility is based on the Appalachian Regional Commission's definition of coal-impacted counties and distressed or economically at-risk areas. And our work focuses on what we like to describe as anchor institutions in local communities. So that looks like public buildings and facilities. It looks like local nonprofit organizations and tax-exempt entities, and also local commercial businesses that provide important services and products for their local communities. So we help support solar on these types of facilities. Everything from public schools and municipal facilities to libraries and churches and faith institutions, local nonprofits, labor unions, animal shelters, facilities providing services for unhoused people, and also local businesses. So we can go to the next slide. And we provide our support in a number of different ways. And the recent federal legislation to support clean energy development has really spurred so much opportunity and so much interest in solar development for local entities. It's served as a real catalyst for our work and also changed some of the focus and needs and demands that we're hearing about and reacting to in local communities. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Just to queue up the types of tools and strategies we use to meet financial and technical assistance needs, we're able to provide direct grant subawards to offset solar project costs for nonprofit and public entities. This is through an Appalachian Regional Commission Power Initiative Award that we are able to supply this type of direct cost support to these local solar projects. We also have a small and hopefully growing fund available for what we call solar readiness issues. It's very common for facilities to have aging roofs that need to be repaired or replaced. And so we're able to provide cost support for nonprofit and public buildings to do those roof replacements. There are also pretty common issues with like needs for wiring upgrades and other building upgrade needs. And so as time goes by, our intent is to address those needs in an ever more holistic manner and to expand our capacity to address the real building stock issues that exist in Central Appalachian communities and provide assistance to help those communities create better, more efficient, more resilient, and more sustainable built environments. We also provide a very flexible range of technical assistance. And this we can do for commercial businesses as well as tax-exempt entities. We can provide very early pre-development assistance, like a feasibility study for a municipality or a campus or a facility to understand whether and how and in what ways solar energy may be feasible for their institution. We can provide technical assistance all the way through the solar pre-development and development process to really walk projects and building owners through that process and provide the support institutions need to successfully implement and construct solar. So from those early stage feasibility studies, continuing through needs for grant writing to find other funding sources, especially federal funding. We can provide cost support for that type of grant writing and packaging. We can provide technical assistance cost support for like engineering and design that needs to happen later on in the pre-development process. we can offset the costs of utility interconnection and jurisdictional permitting. So in any way we can step in and help fill gaps in the needs and provide support for those needs, that's what we want to do with this program. We're also very keen on developing local solar workforce capacity, and we have some very important partnerships with education institutions and employers and state and local funders that recognize the great need for building out our solar workforce capacity in this region. And so we're able to provide cost support for the planning and development of training programs, curriculum development, instructors, and in some cases we're actually able to pay wages for apprentices to receive on-the-job training on real solar installations. And then finally, last but not least, I think this is really the key piece that relates to the federal legislation and the impacts of the IRA on solar development. We are able to provide short-term bridge loans and credit enhancements through our partner, Invest Appalachia. Those bridge loans are a really key and growing piece in terms of the demand for that specific financing product for tax-exempt entities that are eligible for the IRA established elective payment of the solar investment tax credit. For the first time ever, tax-exempt entities are able to take advantage of the investment tax credit through direct payment of that, the value of that credit. That payment is reimbursable in the tax year in which the solar project is constructed. And so in reality, that creates a time gap between project construction and the time at which the project owner is able to receive that payment from the US Treasury. And so there is a great need for that upfront capital, especially for small to medium-sized commercial projects that may not be eligible for PPAs or third-party financing and need to own and finance that project in-house, and may have a hard time coming up with that upfront capital to cover the investment tax credit. So we can go to the next slide where I can talk a little bit more about that. As I already mentioned, the federal solar investment tax credit offsets 30% of total project cost, not up to, but the baseline is 30%. And that direct payment option for tax-exempt entities, I really can't overemphasize how much that has changed the game and impacted the bottom line for these projects. These projects were in effect 30% more expensive before the IRA was passed to law. In addition to that 30% baseline, there are a number of tax credit bonuses that make solar financing even more attractive these days. Projects located in federally designated energy communities are eligible for an additional 10% bonus tax credit above the baseline 30% ITC. And energy communities include communities that have historically been reliant on coal and power plants, communities, and other fossil fuel economic development, as well as there are unemployment data involved in the designation of those energy communities as well. You're able to find a federal designation of those communities if you're interested to see whether your community is considered an energy community or not. Many of the communities in which we work in Central Appalachia are considered energy communities, and so they are looking at a 40% federal tax credit or elective payment in that case. There are additional tax credits for domestic content. This is challenging to meet for most small-scale solar projects in our region right now. That's what I've been hearing from developers and installers that we work with often. But in the future, as more equipment manufacturing in the United States does ramp up and gear up as part of the results of the IRA legislation and its focus on domestic clean energy manufacturing, we do believe that more and more solar projects will be able to meet that domestic content threshold bonus credit as well. And then finally, there's another 10% bonus for projects in qualified low-income communities, and that's a 10% bonus or 20% bonus for projects classified as benefiting low-income communities. The low-income bonuses are a little more complicated because they are administered separately from the rest of these ITC-focused tax credits. There is an annual pool of funding that is allocated for these low-income bonuses, and so it is effectively a lottery system. You know, you can apply for the funding, you can be eligible for the funding, but you may or may not receive the funding depending on how quickly that annual pool gets drawn down. So we like to frame this as, you know, a potential tax credit, but not a guarantee when you're thinking about project financing. And we can move on to the next slide. So, you know, we really try and help project owners walk through the process of like creating a functional capital stack for their project. And what that looks like is different for every solar project we work with. Our grant funding is just one small but often very important piece of that stack. If we can offer a 20% grant to a small local entity or community or municipality early on in their project planning and development, that often provides the confidence and the energy that spurs decision makers within that organization to really feel confident about the project, to get serious about it, and to say yes to investing in solar. We can also come in late and fill a remaining gap in a capital stack with other funding, with this, you know, small but catalytic grant funding. The incentives and the tax credits and the offsets provided through the Inflation Reduction Act have, as I said, like really changed the game and the outcomes for many of these projects. Projects that did not pencil out prior to the passage of the IRA are now, you know, penciling out, and more projects are moving forward as a result of that legislation. Our credit enhancements and repayable financing through Invest Appalachia provides yet another layer of flexible capital to absorb risk and to fill gaps. Essentially, Invest Appalachia is providing repayable grants to serve as 0% short-term bridge loans for entities expecting ITC elective payment reimbursement. And that is, in effect, a revolving fund that will come back and be able to be reused and recirculated year after year. It is our most critical need and gap right now, finding and securing additional flexible impact investments, philanthropic investment, and impact capital to provide those short-term bridge loans is the demand is far outstripping our capacity to currently meet right now. So I'm stating that very plainly and saying, like, our primary fundraising focus and challenge for this year is that short-term bridge financing. And my hope is that the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund will be a major new source of that type of flexible, repayable, catalytic financing to help even more solar projects meet that gap. And then, you know, those capital stacks from there on up look a lot different depending on the size and shape of the projects, investors, and different types of ownership structures and lending. And I don't want to, you know, give short shrift to the importance of traditional, you know, banks and also community development finance institutions and other non-conventional lenders as well. We work very closely with the lending institutions that already exist in the ecosystem that already exists. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to identify the gaps and challenges in that available financing and find new innovative products and structures to meet those challenges. We can go to the next slide, please. So our program launched in 2021 with an Appalachian Regional Commission Power Initiative Award, and since then we have supported 47 new solar projects in 42 Central Appalachian communities in 5 states. We have pledged 1.6 million in grant funding and technical assistance to deploy 6.4 megawatts of new solar capacity in the region. That 1.6 million in catalytic investment from the Solar Finance Fund leverages a total of 15 million in private and public investment toward those projects. And over the lifetime of those projects, the buildings and the project owners and the institutions they serve will save over 25 million in energy costs. So these are long-term savings that represent really important financial benefits for these local anchor institutions that serve those local communities. They're able to circulate those cost savings right back into new jobs, hiring new employees, creating better wages, and growing the scope and the impact of the services that they provide locally. We have heard from the solar installers and developers that we work with that there have been 20 new solar jobs directly created as a result of these projects. In addition to that, based on the scale and the scope of that investment, over 104 solar jobs in those local businesses have been directly retained. And more broadly, those cost savings by those beneficiary institutions support an additional 116 local jobs in our local economies, in our region's economy. And we're offsetting many thousands of tons of CO2 equivalent emissions every year. So there are important climate benefits to this work as well. I will wrap up there. If you'll move to the next slide, I'm happy to answer questions now throughout the webinar at the end. And folks are very welcome to reach out. Solarfinancefund.org is our website, and you can contact me directly if you have questions or want to talk more about a project in our eligible service area. And I will pass along the mic now to Dr. Moleka.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, for that wonderful presentation. So to kick off from where ended, I will walk us through just a couple of steps. She did an amazing job talking through the different tax credits. I'll just highlight a few components there. Then we'll look at the developer perspective. Then we'll also look at the lender perspective. Then we'll see the interconnection as well as linking it up to the climate solution aspects of our webinar and the place of data science into the work that we do. So as we heard from Often, it's really important to really maximize and leverage this available tax credit. So we know that the ICT has 30%, which is kind of a guarantee. But there are also two components into this particular bucket. So we have two stackable credits. Most low-income communities, Justice 40 communities, who benefit from the brownfield, which is the energy communities credit of 10%. But as she mentioned, the solar industry is evolving with the different technologies, and hopefully there's a possibility that most installers will also take advantage of the domestic content. So these two credits are kind of stackable to the 30% ICT. On the other hand, we also have bonus credits. I call these amplifiers. What is important is for us to be able to understand the requirements. So for the low-income communities, most disadvantaged communities have very high energy burdens and poverty rates. So we're assuming that a lot of them will qualify for that 10% additional bonus credits. However, these are competitive credits. So there's an annual allocation as well, as often mentioned. There's no guarantee. So applying early if we meet the eligibility requirement is really important. And there are also other components there which gives up to 20% the low-income residential tax credits, but there are requirements for an equal share or equal consumption. So I think it's really important to start early to be able to understand how can we leverage the available credits and how can we take advantage of the bonus credits. I call them amplifiers because what that does is that it increases the tax credit. And if the tax credit increases, then we know what happens from an economic perspective. It implies we're able to it reduces our overhead costs, and if that overhead cost reduces, then we're able to offer more meaningful benefits. Now, yesterday, the U.S. Department of the Treasury released the final guidance for the elective pay, and the procedures are the same. So first of all, there's that project identification. So understanding what we want to invest in. Is it like solar only or solar and energy storage capacity? And once we've identified that, I think the next step is to be able to understand the credit selections, which applies to a particular case. Then the next process, we have the contracting, the negotiating, the permitting. It goes to construction. The project is in operation, is placed in service. But to take advantage of this tax credit, it's important that we do the pre-filing to be able to have a registration number. Now, if we have multiple different projects, we have to, according to the guidance that was released yesterday, we have to fill out each individual application. And then the next process is that once we have the identification number, without the identification number, I think it's practically impossible to be able to take advantage of the tax credit when we file our tax returns. And that bonus comes as a result when the tax returns are approved. Now, the other issue, which I think from a development perspective and implementation perspective also mentioned very well, is the upfront costs. Now, for developers needs to be targeted. So this is not just an aspect where we want to maximize tax benefits, but we want to ensure that we are targeted in our approach. So we're solving some of the challenges that really confront this low-income community. So we know of all these different factors. Justice 40, these are disadvantaged communities. So by so doing, hypothetically, we're saying that we cannot talk of climate solution or climate justice without talking about economic justice, because it's linked to sustainability and how we provide meaningful benefits, affordable benefits to these communities. But there's also another question from a developer perspective. How do I finance these upfront costs? We know that there's kind of with CDFIs have come into play. We have larger CDFIs and smaller CDFIs, green banks as well. There are also community development credit unions, venture capital funds, as well as that bridge loan. So these different financing options are available. Bridge loans, as we know, are short-term loans to be able to finance some of these projects. Now, understanding which particular financing option works for a particular project is important in consideration with the that particular lender. Now, what we're seeing increasingly, which I'm also advocating in this presentation, is that there needs to be a connection between the developer as well as the community lender. So community lenders have they have also an incentive, for example, the incentives are kind of driven by equity, for example. So they want to ensure that community lenders are all committed to this goal of climate justice and economic justice for these disadvantaged communities, and to be able to ensure that they follow equitable, inclusive, accessible, as well as affordable lending options, which implies including giving out loans with affordable rates. If we do that, what we will see is that we are kind of maximizing impact and minimizing risks, which is very important. And that requires community engagement and collaboration. So the goals of the community lender should also tie in with that of the solar developer. The solar developer, on the other hand, also have a responsibility to play to be able to ensure that, we bring meaningful benefit to this community. That includes accessibility. It includes being inclusive, including sharing out some of the benefits, increasing the bill saving benefits and ensuring that, for example, for the low-income residential credit, there's a requirement for an equal share, whether that is a curve system or how that allocation is decided based on the capacity and the usage of the building. One resource that developers can take advantage of is the LEAF Toolkit Solar for All project, which, as Alicia did mention, Groundswell led a 3-year research funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. It's an amazing resource for pre-development to be able to understand, because most of these federal tax credits are also geographically related. So we have to be able to understand, where can I maximize this credit based on the location as well. Now, once we've decided, we have an understanding of the goals that we want to achieve, climate equity goals, then from a developer perspective now, we have to look at some of those projects. The advantage of the recent law, now the regulation, is that it now includes different types of projects. Before the IRA, we had only solar storage projects, but now we can either have solar only projects, we can have a combination of wind energy projects, or solar and battery energy projects, so which are really important, including energy efficiency. So for example, some tax exempt organizations like local churches may want to be able to do upgrades. And so there are different tax credits that are applied to that, so there's a clean energy credits through the ITC that can apply to that. They can also look at maybe some production tax credits that may also apply to that, but to their particular situation. Now, where does climate solution comes into play? I want to say climate solution now is an outcome of all the different things that we've done right. So it's not giving, it's something that we want to see. And for us to be able to have climate solutions, so these climate solutions, it can also be decarbonization. So there's a twin goal. We're providing solar to bringing energy, clean energy, not just energy, replacing the old framework to now clean energy framework. But there's a twin goal of sustainability, providing clean energy as well as decarbonization. No one can argue the fact that we need an environmentally clean world right now, whether that implies we're looking at it in terms of EVs, electric vehicles, we're looking at it in terms of rural electrification and transportation. One of the things with the final guidelines is that rural cooperatives are also included, and they are really centered to bring about meaningful changes in some of the rural communities where energy burdens are really high, as well as very high poverty rates. And when we do this, then we'll be able to see some of the climate solutions, and that includes greenhouse gas reduction. Because if we don't have efficient, clean energy appliances, even in our homes or within our communities, then we cannot be asserting that we'll be able to reduce some of the greenhouse gases effect. Now, finally, there's also an aspect of accountability. And that accountability, I think, is double-fold, as I said. So my presentation today is not just to talk about community lenders. They are really important, but also from the developer perspective. And this is where data science comes into play now. So we need to ensure that we develop measures and metrics that kind of really track and evaluate the performance of at the lending level. We also look at the community level and inclusive of the design and implementation, and then to be able to see if we have specific benchmarks. So I think of reasonability analysis. Does the metric, do they make sense, or can we come up with different benchmark analysis? So I think from a data science perspective, it's important we follow these guidelines, but also being able to track and to measure the extent to which we've been able to achieve climate justice. A very good example is our City of Refuge project in Baltimore, Maryland, that Groundswell led and developed using a CDFI that kind of incorporated all of these frameworks. So what we want to see and what we will see eventually is just that rapid expansion of projects that kind of embed these recommendations to be able to serve our communities with integrity, with justice, and with equity, and to ensure that we build communities and we support community voices. So I think this is really crucial, not only from the federal level and the taxes, not only from the developer's perspective to be able to ensure that there's alignment with the federal taxes, or from the lender's perspective to ensure that it's also community driven, they are committed as well, and there's alignment as well with those communities. But more importantly, the target should be about climate reduction. And if climate reduction is a target, then we should be able to, we need to be accountable to how we evaluate and monitor the progress to which we've attained certain goals. So with that being said, I will pass it on to Hana.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hana Vizcarra, and I am an attorney with Earthjustice. Next slide, please. I focus on national climate issues, so federal regulatory actions and litigation around climate. Earthjustice is the nation's top environmental law organization. We were created more than 4 decades ago and have helped more than 1,000 public interest clients fight and win for a healthy environment for free. Next slide, please. We have over 250 attorneys, policy and legislative experts, legal and research analysts, staff scientists, community scientists, strategists, and more who together work to take on high stakes cases to achieve long-lasting change. We're committed to our cases for the long haul. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to say a little bit about our clients. Typically, Earthjustice represents, well, I guess there's no real typical client, I should say. Earthjustice represents a broad range of clients, from large environmental organizations with millions of members to one-stoplight communities settled generations ago. And all of our clients are fighting to make our planet a healthier place. Next slide, please. In relation to the Inflation Reduction Act, our federal policy team was instrumental in helping to pass this legislation and work to prioritize zero emissions technology and benefits going to communities most impacted by legacy fossil fuels. Our lawyers and policy staff continue to work on the implementation of the IRA, and that's really where my work intersects with the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly than our other panelists today about the Inflation Reduction Act and what else, and so what it encompasses. It's a big piece of legislation with a whole lot of pieces, and I'm just going to highlight some of the things that Earthjustice has been involved with, particularly on the implementation side. Next slide, please. Solar for All. So this really connects back to what you've heard already. One of the programs within the Inflation Reduction Act is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Earthjustice specifically fought to ensure that $7 billion in funding from within that fund would go to help low-income and disadvantaged communities to access zero emissions, but specifically also solar technology. It's a dedicated set of funds within this $27 billion larger greenhouse gas reduction fund that goes to grants to states, municipalities, tribal governments, and other eligible recipients for these communities. And we've continued are proud of our efforts to advocate at EPA during the implementation of this program to protect the intent of these funds, which really was to make sure that they could prioritize rooftop and community solar. And the guidance that EPA ultimately put out did just that. The other $20 billion of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is more broadly available to projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, with $8 billion of that within that $20 million specifically dedicated to low-income communities. Next slide, please. As part of this this larger GRF, EPA has announced funding opportunities for 3 different programs: the Solar for All grant program that we mentioned already. There's the National Clean Investment Fund that funds national nonprofit entities to create the national clean financing institutions that will then partner with the private sector to provide accessible, affordable financing. And then the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, which will fund hub nonprofits to provide funding and technical assistance to specific networks of community leaders, financing clean tech projects in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So some of the other work that we are closely involved in is really around other features of this and some of the other recent federal legislation. In particular, electric vehicles is one of the areas that we do in which we do a lot of work. This year, the Department of Transportation and DOE announced $325 million in investments to upgrade and replace non-operational chargers and reduce the costs of installing charging infrastructure in underserved communities. I should clarify here that this particular investment is from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, infrastructure law, not the Inflation Reduction Act, but there was a significant amount of funding in that law as well, which came before, that's then just been enhanced by the Inflation Reduction Act measures. And this particular funding sort of further builds on a $1 billion in grants that have already been announced to electrify Class 6 and 7 vehicles, which most of those are likely school buses, but it's possible EPA will also allow money to be used for transit buses, drayage trucks, refuse trucks, and things of that nature. We don't have yet the specific guidance on how that will look. And then the Department of Treasury and Energy have released guidelines for their Inflation Reduction Act 30C tax credit, which you've already heard some about, which makes the credit available to a large number of Americans. And one of the things I would like to highlight there, you hear a lot about this being available for low-income and non-urban communities. The guidelines that have come out about this make the eligibility pretty broad. So it is actually available probably to more households than you might otherwise think. Next slide, please. So we also are involved in a whole bunch of other parts of funding that came out of this legislation. I do quite a bit of work around methane emissions reduction in the oil and gas sector. The methane emissions reduction program includes a waste fee, for companies and operators who are not capturing and controlling their methane emissions. And it is intended to work in concert with new EPA regulations that were just finalized on oil and gas producers, requiring them to better control their emissions. And until they come into full compliance, they have to, under this new Inflation Reduction Act provision, they will also have be subject to a fee. There's also funding for clean ports, $3 billion from the legislation to clean up air pollution and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at ports. That program was just announced in February, and it will focus on deploying clean zero emission technologies and developing new port infrastructure planning and strategies. There's 2 grant programs within that. The $2.8 billion zero emissions technology deployment competition, which will directly fund zero emission port equipment and infrastructure, and $150 million climate and air quality planning competition that will fund planning activities at U.S. ports. And then we're also engaged on climate smart agriculture. The Inflation Reduction Act has $20 billion directed to existing conservation programs that were really underfunded, and it fills a significant funding gap in that area. Next slide, please. Earthjustice has a Right to Zero campaign that encompasses a whole broad array of efforts to electrify different portions of our economy, and while also focusing on renewable energy development to serve that new electrification. Next slide, please. And then the other piece that we do that connects to this work, and in particular is the area where I'm most engaged with on the Inflation Reduction Act implementation and what comes out of that, is really working to protect communities from potential build-outs that aren't as beneficial to them. So there's a whole array of tax credits around hydrogen production and use, around CCS build-out, that's carbon capture and sequestration efforts. And so we've been working through comments to the Department of Treasury, to engagement with the Department of Energy and EPA to ensure that as these pieces of the law are implemented, that the guidance and interpretation about who's eligible and what counts as clean are as tight as they can be. So we limit the potential negative impacts on communities, and we prioritize both the cleanest projects as well as those that also have benefits for other toxic emissions outside of just the greenhouse gas emissions. And I think I will stop there so we can get to our conversation. Thank you.
And thank you all so much. And I feel like learned a lot with that. And we have some great questions in the comments. So I wanted to jump right into that. First, we have a question from Kathleen, who her church needs a new roof and heating and cooling units that be used, change from electric to gas. Is it possible to use some of these grants we've been talking about today to really help them do that?
Well, I would love to say that the Appalachian Solar Finance Fund could provide some, at least, introductions within our region, but it honestly depends on where you're located, Kathleen. Invest Appalachia is a regional entity we partner with that services all of the Appalachian Regional Commission counties. Beyond Appalachia, I would need to turn it over to some of my other presenters. I think there are federal rebates available for commercial buildings for electrification and energy efficiency upgrades. So it's definitely worth looking into that in terms of like HVAC rebate programs. Also, your utility might offer rebates or on-bill financing for HVAC and electrification and energy efficiency upgrades for your building. So that's another potential source of information and resources to check out through your electric utility provider.
Yeah, I think spot on, Irvin, for that. I think to add to that, I think checking the requirements as to what qualifies as a clean energy project is really important, because I know the elective pay or direct pay option of the ITC, implies that tax exempt institutions, organizations can really take advantage of this credit. So it's important to really check what qualifies. And but I think it's really, from what I see, changing from gas to electric, seems to me like kind of an energy efficiency upgrades, which, like I often did mention, taking advantage of those rebates, I think will go a long way, including the lawnmower that you mentioned there, which fits in within the electric vehicle category for the clean energy tax credit within the ICT. So to add to that, I think just looking at, it's a comprehensive guide. Our advice, we go in there, just look at that within a specific situation. But I think there are components there. Those rebates are important. Incentives are also important, as well as some of those federal incentives. So I think that's really a good starting point to understand what qualifies and what does not.
Awesome. And so with that, I know we've talked a lot about those tax credits specifically for serving low to moderate income communities, and have a great question. And Autumn will be sharing that link, your link in the chat. But so, is there still space for people to take part in those tax credits for LMI communities?
Yeah, the LMI bonus credit is heavily oversubscribed in some categories, but it came to my attention just last week. I was at a convening about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, and someone there pointed out to attendees that there are still megawatts available in some of the categories that have been specifically allocated to projects that meet some of those additional selection criteria. Those additional selection criteria prioritize applications based on ownership by tax-exempt entities, 501cs, municipal, state, or tribal governments, Alaska Native corporations.
Yeah.
And then also there's geographic criteria in that additional selection criteria. And the focus is in persistent poverty counties or census tracts that are designated as disadvantaged. And in some of those categorical allocations, there is still capacity available.
And that's really helpful, I think, for a lot of people, because they just need to know what options are available. So, looping back just a little bit, and this is a question for everyone really, what are the biggest changes that you've seen in clean energy financing since the implementation of the IRA?
I think I'll take a lead there. There are a lot of them. I'll just speak on a couple of them. So I think, as I mentioned, it's kind of embedded within our work right now, both from a developer perspective as well as from a financier perspective. But one of the things that we've seen is just that increased awareness of climate change, and making sure that communities that have been impacted environmentally or justice for the communities begin to see some of these benefits. So I think there's just a huge awareness now, which is incorporated within corporate goals for most of these lenders, that support for disadvantaged communities is one of the things that is really fundamental in their goals. So I think that's just one thing that I want to share.
Yeah, and I can add to that. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS Act, these have all injected unprecedented federal funding into community-focused clean energy project development. And in addition to the expansion and expanded availability of and accessibility of the federal tax credits, which have impacted project costs so positively, the very imminent award announcements for the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a huge upcoming decision. This program will create a series of new national and regional green bank type entities to distribute many billions of dollars into clean energy financing. And the focus is very much on those justice 40 communities, on disadvantaged communities, on communities that are working to transition from reliance on a fossil fuel economy, on the coal economy. And so I'm very excited to see the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund get implemented, and I am anxious, and I know that a lot of folks are working really hard and planning, to ensure that those dollars do go to the most needful communities where they will have the most impact and they're most needed.
And I just wanted to add that our policy team put together a sort of year in review after the first year of the Inflation Reduction Act, just talking about what it has spurred so far, what to look forward to. And I just shared, I don't know if I can access the chat directly, but I just shared the link for that. That hopefully we can get into the general chat. That has a nice rundown of sort of some of the initial bigger solar projects that have been spurred by this legislation, some of the, sort of the totals around energy rebates and air monitoring projects. Another big piece of funding that is important to our communities and clients is air monitoring. There's a lot of money connected to this legislation for community air monitoring that otherwise wasn't getting done. That we often are push pretty hard on our regulators to try to improve and increase monitoring around polluting facilities, but it is a hard go. And one of the big successes for us in this legislation was more funding for that. Anyway, there's a whole range of other items in there that can give you a kind of a nice overview of some of the things we've seen since this was enacted.
Thank you so much. And we have a question from over in the Q&A. And this ties back to what you're talking about with bridge funding. Well, this a little bit, I think, but why is it so important to have bridge funding, and what does that look like with what you're doing with the Solar Finance Fund?
Yeah, just to reiterate, the importance of this short-term gap-filling access to capital is a really critical need right now for projects to be able to have the upfront dollars they need to construct a solar project. You need to be able to pay your contractor, pay your developer upfront to get that project implemented. And at the end of the year of construction, your construction tax year, that's when you're going to be able to file for registry you need to register and file for elective payment of the ITC. And so that effectively will not happen until halfway through the following year after your project is constructed. So there's a situation where there's several, it could be several months, could be a year and a half, it's probably less than 2 years. But if the project delays occur and your project rolls into the following tax year, then you're looking at an even longer period of time. And so that short-term bridge funding to ensure that these local organizations have access to that upfront construction capital is what we're trying to provide with this bridge funding. And we have used catalytic philanthropic dollars to provide 0% interest repayable grants to small nonprofits that need these small injections of capital to fill those gaps. And so, that's 30 or 40% of your project cost, most likely. We know you're going to get that back. We're very confident in, it's a low risk transaction because it's a federal reimbursement. And so what is needed now is just like flexible capital to deploy into that type of revolving fund so that we can serve even more of those projects because the demand is very great. And there are, there's various restrictions on the way that federal funding can be used to sort of prevent us from being able to use some of our federal award dollars to serve that purpose. So we're really interested in the role of impact investment and the role of philanthropy in filling that gap and recognizing like the need for that specific product that we can provide. We just need to build our sort of war chest to provide that product.
And thank you so much for that, Autumn. And I know we're almost at time, but I see if we can get one more question real quick. This might be a little rapid fire, but for Hana and Autumn, how do you hold accountable the new money flowing for finance to make sure that organizations that are actually able with technical support to environmental justice communities?
So part of the way, we're involved with that is to help help the agencies really develop good technical guidance on how these things are implemented and what the eligibility looks like. So you mentioned a few of the the Solar for All and some of the other granting programs, where they've accepted, I think, they've opened them up, but you haven't seen sort of the result of that yet. Those haven't come out exactly. So, who's going to be managing the Green Bank funds is still a work in progress. So, we don't yet have that implemented on the ground, but there, on the early side, before they could get there was, you had to engage with the agent. We had to engage with the agency around what are the definitions of how this is going to work? What is the guidance and eligibility requirements going to look like? And so that's sort of where we've been playing a role. And then, of course, once this stuff comes out and you see who's actually implementing these, getting the funds and implementing the programs, there's a whole nother level of oversight that would need to come in at that stage.
And thank you so much, and for helping answer those questions and for being here on the webinar today. I've really enjoyed hearing from all of you, and I think our audience has been able to learn a lot. If we will share a recording of this webinar afterwards for anyone who wants to go back and watch or share it with colleagues who weren't able to make it. And with that, I want to express my gratitude for all of our panelists, Autumn Long, Dr. Elvis Moleka, and Hana Vizcarra, for taking time out of their busy schedules to speak at our webinar today. I'm also want to extend my thanks to everyone in the audience who joined us today. Finally, I'm pleased to announce that our next Energy Futures webinar is scheduled for June 5th at noon. And a link to that registration page for the webinar should be coming through shortly. Thank you all for joining us today for the webinar. And this is Alicia B. Hill, serving with joy.